Would you say that what we're seeing from Hezbollah right now is indicative of the power that it has?
Oh, I think they probably have rockets that can reach Tel Aviv, and they probably know that if they use those rockets, then they would escalate in a way that would incur a price that they may not want to pay, or they may not want to have Lebanon pay, because that would increase the agitation against them in Lebanon. I think it's interesting to note that even as this has happened, the voices coming out of official Lebanon have been anti-Israel, not anti-Hezbollah. That may be a bit of a disappointment to people who might be hoping that Lebanon might rebel, or the army or the government might somehow try to reassert their sovereignty. At this point, they're either too afraid, or that simply is not what they want to do. But Hezbollah and Iran are ciphers. We can't read the minds of Khamenei and of Nasrallah. We can make assessments. Israel has decided it's fairly transparent. They want Hezbollah to cease firing and to move back from the border. So anything else is really speculation.
The last strikes by Israel, not just the airstrikes, actually, these special operations with the beeper and the pager and what have you, and the targeting has shown Hezbollah something crucial, and the Iran regime as well, that Israel has an absolute X-ray information about Hezbollah. Nobody in Lebanon imagined that they would target with that precision. Israel is not carpet bombing Lebanon like people would think. It's actually going so specific. And the videos that appeared in social media stunned not just the Lebanese, but Americans and everybody else. So Israel is now demonstrating that it can continue with the war. It is low price. I don't know how much it's going to cost, but without having the Israeli army inside Lebanon. The real response to that, will the Lebanese people rise? Because what Israel has done over the past 3 days was to target Hezbollah positions hiding inside the Druze and Christian and Sunni areas. And those three communities are saying, my goodness, Hezbollah was here with all their power and missiles. So that is slowly changing the psychological balance of power, or psychological balance of ideas in Lebanon.
Walid, thank you so much for joining us. Just so interesting to hear your perspective every single time you come onto the show. I hope we're going to have you back soon in the coming days with more insight as to the Lebanese public perception as the fighting escalates. I'd like to turn back to our guests in the studio. Dan, I saw that there was something that you wanted to comment on that you heard Walid
Well, I wanted to ask Walid whether there is any chance that Israel gets what it wants, which is, once it has displayed all these impressive capabilities, that one way or another, Hezbollah and Iran do an elegant about-face and basically climb down from the very, very high ladder that they have gotten themselves on. There's all kinds of suggestions that now that they understand, they'd like to stop and somehow give up. But I don't think that's in their DNA at all. It's very hard to imagine Nasrallah saying, well, you know what, I'm going to stop the rockets, despite my continuing solidarity with Hamas. So I think that leaves Israel in despite what appears to be a successful in its way beginning to this particular campaign, in an impossible strategic situation where to achieve what they want, it's difficult to imagine anything other than a ground presence in Lebanon, which I don't think Israel wants. But the thing it does want may be unachievable.
And the question of a diplomatic solution, I think, relies on the idea that there will be some kind of enforcement mechanism that will actually enforce Resolution 1701 of the United Nations Security Council, which, let's remember, for the past 20-something years has been utterly ignored by Hezbollah. UNIFIL has totally failed in their annual reports. They don't even mention any of the weapons that have flooded southern Lebanon. UNIFIL is a joke. It's a sad joke, but it is a joke. So who's going to enforce this? And that has to be a key Israeli demand to the international community. It's not enough just to hold the fire. Who is going to enforce this? Because if nobody will, then Israel will have to do that. I don't think after the 7th of October, Israel will tolerate a reality in which the Radwan unit and Hezbollah are back on the border preparing the next massacre. So these are the key questions going forward.
I mean, the question is what it will take at this point to get Hezbollah to move back. If, like you said, there's been no diplomatic action that has made any impact whatsoever over the course of the last 2 decades. I'm interested, Dan, to kind of hear what you think the UN's role is at this point, anyhow, in international affairs.
The UN doesn't have to be such a joke. The UN is not just a circus-like and toothless General Assembly, which is a talking shop at best. Good place for people to meet. I don't discount that Netanyahu can meet a lot of people this week. But it's also the UN Security Council that has something resembling the force of international law. There's a lot of institutions that play an important role in the world, UNICEF and World Health Organization. I wouldn't say the UN is meaningless. The UN has made itself ridiculous in the context of Israel by pretending like Israel is the only miscreant in the world to a degree that is basically farcical. But it doesn't have to be that way. So Guterres doesn't have a lot of impact on Israel, but this doesn't stop him from criticizing Israel morning, noon, and night. So maybe he ought to look around and, you know, broaden his diameter away from Tel Aviv and consider that there are other countries he may be criticizing. Maybe, even though Yaakov, my friend, is right in saying Lebanon is hapless, doesn't have to be. Lebanon can ask for help, but they're not asking for help. Iran is creating all kinds of chaos all over the region. It's a regional rogue. Why doesn't Guterres call out Iran? In other words, there are things that they could do to build the global narrative that might make them not irrelevant.
Right.
And as for southern Lebanon, it's very clear. If Lebanon can't enforce their own sovereignty on the south of the border, someone else has to. I really don't want it to be Israel, but it'll have to be unless UNIFIL is basically amplified 50x, or some sort of international force, and I don't see why it wouldn't be NATO, goes in. Mm-hmm. Now, the world hasn't felt the urgency to do this, and we all know that there's war weariness because of Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe one good thing that can come out of Israel's actions of the recent days is to create that urgency. Because if they're really upset about Israel going in, maybe they should focus on an alternative.
Now that we are seeing this escalation, are we going to hear and see a change in the public perception across the country as to what needs to be done here?
I think there is a sense that the envelope has been pushed too far, and that Israel has to fix a whole set of problems on its many fronts. I hope it doesn't lead to a purely muscle-bound reaction, and they also use the country uses its brain. But in public opinion right now is definitely behind at least a short period of some sacrifice to fix these problems. But there's also a lot of bitterness about the fact that the government and perhaps, as you suggested, society more or less abandoned the periphery. You know, there's a meme that's been making the rounds. I saw yesterday that is a sort of a fake order from or recommendation note from the from the home front, and it basically says home front guidelines. And the guideline is basically live in Tel Aviv, because everything else you're on your own. There is a sense that has to end, right? But I would hate to have Israel be infected by this Spartan notion of a nation on its own fighting its way to some elusive far-off victory. Israel, if it handled itself correctly, would have, I think, the support of certainly the Western world in its fight against Hezbollah. The Western world doesn't really want to be dragged into it, but Israel has such an excellent case to prosecute that, done correctly, I think it could be successful. And by the way, it really means taking very seriously the narrative that is already starting to be entrenched. And you see it in the headlines everywhere, that Israel is killing civilians in Lebanon. It has to make every effort not to be seen to be making every effort not to, and to project that it doesn't want to. Otherwise, within a week, it will have lost its whatever it has of a moral high ground, same as happened on the Gaza front, and the entire dynamic will be about pressuring Israel to stop before the job is done.